I call Andrew Little.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, it will be known to this Parliament, most members of this Parliament, that every time the national government touches a piece of employment legislation, it either completely turns to custard or what it routinely does is takes rights away from working people. It doesn't necessarily enhance rights for employers or make it easier or better for them, but it always penalises workers. And this piece of legislation is a bit like the curate's egg. I know it's a cliche. Some parts of it actually maybe aren't too bad. But there's one part of it that is an absolute shocker and will turn workplaces and those who use part-time workers and casual workers into an utter shambles. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, Mr Speaker, but I do want to acknowledge, as I said before, there are some parts of this legislation that actually, on the face of it, maybe aren't too bad, and we will work with the government and our colleagues in other parties at the Select Committee to work our way through and make sure we get the best out of it. It is disappointing that the provisions about paid parental leave do not meet the very clear expectations of most New Zealanders that we will have 26 weeks paid parental leave, the Sue Moroney legislation, the work that Sue Moroney has championed and been the vanguard of, but that's all right. Typical for this government, just do a little bit, sort of put the reel out, just do enough to sort of get the monkey off the back, and they've done that. I am intrigued by this new reference, this new provision, this new employment law beast called keeping in touch days. And I do wonder whether this is a bit of self-interest on the National Party. Knowing how far out of touch they are, they now need to set aside special days to put themselves in touch. Well, I'm not going to criticise them for it, and I'm happy to grant them leave for as many days as they need to be in touch again, because they are desperately out of touch, as has been demonstrated so much just in the last few weeks. I want to turn to what I think is the critical part, the essential part of this piece of legislation. Bearing in mind that the minister who has introduced this legislation has gone on record publicly several times to say that this will deal with the evil of 0 hours contracts. And of course, we now know that it won't. And anybody who says to the public of New Zealand, to the workers of New Zealand, that there is now legislation before Parliament that will put to bed the evils of 0 hours contracts, well, anybody who is saying that is misleading New Zealanders, and that isn't acceptable. I don't want to turn this into a committee stages speech, but I do want to prevail for a little moment on clause 87 and the proposed new sections 67C to 67H, because I do not know how a minister or a cabinet or members doing their job, looking through this legislation before it is even introduced, could have allowed this to get through the approval channels. These are the provisions that deal with what are meant to be, or what they say will deal with 0 hours contracts. And so it provides for hours of work to be provided in an individual agreement or a collective agreement. And then it provides for this beast called the availability provision. Availability provision. So the worker is required to be available under the employment agreement. It talks about an availability provision being a provision in an employment agreement under which the employee's performance of work is conditional on the employer making work available. No guarantee of work, it's conditional on the employer making it available. And that there is no obligation on the employer to make work available. Well, that takes us back to the 19th century, and we're now back into, the sort of stuff that Charles Dickens wrote many books about. This is true exploitation, and the fact that this should even be contemplated as a reality is a disgrace on that government. Things have become so bad with the slow and steady erosion of employment law by this government that expectations are now so low about standards that this government can write into a piece of legislation and describe what is abject exploitation of working people in this country. And they do it shamelessly and with smug little smirks on their little faces opposite. This is what employment law has come to in New Zealand today. And then it goes on. It says there might be a requirement for compensation, but doesn't specify what that is. Doesn't even specify how it's determined. And of course we know in the weird world of the National Party how that works. The individual employee is meant to rock on up to the employer and say, and exercise the fullness of their bargaining power and say, oh, I want compensation because you haven't made the work available, even though you're not under any obligation to, and even though there's nothing in my employment agreement. Please pay me compensation. And those of a mad mind opposite seriously think that this sets an employment standard that we should relish and welcome. It creates no enforceable standard at all. It is the removal of any standard. It is the absence of standards. And they have the temerity to introduce that in a piece of legislation called employment standards legislation. This is an outrage, apart from being sheer stupidity. And this is the appalling thing about this legislation. This, if this Parliament is doing its job, and if the members opposite have any conscience, this clause, this provision, cannot survive the legislative making process as this bill goes through its this Parliament. As it goes from here to the Select Committee, if this provision survives in any form at all, then that will be an acceptance and an admission that this Parliament can no longer, under this government, protect the rights and interests of good, hard-working Kiwis. You know, it is acceptable in the realms of employment to have casual employment. We've had it for decades in this country. It is acceptable to have part-time employment. That suits some people. But it has never been acceptable in the 100 and more years of employment legislation and employment regulation to have provisions that allow the sheer exploitation of working people. We've never tolerated that. We've never tolerated, and we should not tolerate it now. And I prevail upon the members opposite and the last speaker from the government who stood up and said, yeah, sure, we'll work some things out. Well, you've got a lot of work, you've got a lot to work out. You've got a lot to change here. You've got a lot to improve, because this, in its present form, is nothing other than a sheer and utter disgrace. And it has to change if this Parliament wants to hold its head up high, and every member in it wants to hold its head up high and say, we are a Parliament that is about fair and just laws. Because that's what should guide us. We are a fair people, and we are a sensible people, and a pragmatic people. And we want good employment regulation, because we know that amongst or alongside the army of very good employers, there are the exploitative and the bad employers. And workers look to this Parliament to say, make sure that amidst all our employment regulation, we cannot be taken advantage of. Make sure that when you are passing laws affecting our rights and interests as workers, that we cannot be exploited. It's not too much to ask. And it's what workers around New Zealand are asking of this Parliament. They are asking it of every MP in this Parliament, and we owe them nothing less. Mr. Speaker, we will support this bill to be scrutinised closely by the Select Committee, but with a very clear expectation that all members of Parliament on that committee, including the members of the government, will make sure that this bill is something that we can be proud of, something that adds to the rights and interests of workers, something that helps employers manage their workforce carefully and sensibly, and does not exploit.